It was an ordinary Saturday morning when I decided to do a bit of work around my property, which included moving my vehicles and temporarily blocking my own driveway. The sun was shining brightly, and a gentle breeze carried the smell of freshly cut grass from the neighboring lawns. I had a full day planned, with errands, a few calls to make, and some outdoor maintenance work that had been long overdue. I maneuvered my truck into the middle of my driveway to unload some tools from the back, not thinking twice about it. After all, it was my property, and I had every right to use my driveway as needed. That's when I noticed her Karen. She had been walking along the sidewalk, a clipboard in hand, wearing her usual scowl. Her eyes locked on my truck immediately, and her stride quickened as though she had discovered some unforgivable crime. I could see her lips moving, though I couldn't hear her from this distance. It was clear she was calculating her approach, preparing to assert her version of authority. I had dealt with her antics before, though never in quite this manner, and I was prepared for the usual blend of indignation and procedural threats. Before I could even step out of the truck, she called out loudly, making sure everyone in the neighborhood could hear. "You can't just block the driveway like this. This is unacceptable. I'm calling the police." Her voice carried the kind of self-righteous authority that she had perfected over the years, the tone that always suggested she believed the rules existed solely for the purpose of controlling others. I took a slow, deliberate breath, choosing not to react with immediate frustration. I had dealt with people like her many times before, and patience would be my strongest ally. I rolled down the window slightly and called back, "Karen, this is my driveway, and my property. I am allowed to use it as I see fit. There's no law being broken here." Her eyes narrowed, and she took a step closer, her posture aggressive and determined. "You think just because it's your property you can do whatever you want? You're disturbing the neighborhood. This is dangerous and inconsiderate. I am calling the police to report this immediately." At that moment, I realized she had completely ignored the obvious fact that I was simply moving vehicles and unloading tools. She had no interest in understanding the situation. Her only goal was to assert dominance, to make others feel small, and to project authority where none existed. I calmly stepped out of the truck, hands visible and empty, projecting a sense of controlled power that contrasted sharply with her agitation. "Karen, please step back," I said evenly. "I am on my property, and I am performing routine tasks. There is no danger here, and your interference is unnecessary." She didn't step back. Instead, she began dialing her phone with deliberate slowness, as if to dramatize her next move. "I'm calling the police," she repeated, louder this time. I watched her carefully, noting her body language, the way she held herself, and the precise moment when she realized I wasn't intimidated. My training and years of military experience had taught me to read situations like this with clarity. This was not a typical neighbor dispute, this was a power play, a test to see if she could provoke fear or compliance. I took a measured step closer, speaking firmly but without raising my voice. "Karen, before you make any calls, let me clarify something important. I am a high-ranking military officer. I am trained in assessing situations, resolving conflicts, and enforcing order where necessary. I have no intention of escalating this, but I will protect my property and my rights." Her hand froze mid-dial. Her expression shifted from indignation to confusion, and I could see the realization dawning slowly on her face. She had expected fear, hesitation, or at least some sign that her threats carried weight. Instead, she was confronted with someone who not only knew his rights but had the authority, discipline, and confidence to enforce them. For the first time, She seemed uncertain, and the clipboard she held suddenly felt less like a shield and more like a flimsy prop in a scenario she no longer controlled. I continued, my tone calm but unyielding. Karen, this is my property. My driveway, my vehicles, and my actions here are entirely legal. Your attempt to interfere is both unnecessary and, frankly, inappropriate. If you insist on involving law enforcement, I will fully cooperate, but I assure you, there is nothing to report. I suggest you step back, reflect on the facts, and allow me to perform my duties here without harassment. For a few moments, she didn't move. The neighborhood around us was quiet, save for a few curious onlookers peeking from their windows and porches. The usual confidence and smugness she relied on to intimidate people seemed to have evaporated in the presence of someone who understood both law and authority. Her mouth opened and closed, her mind racing for a strategy that would restore her perceived control, but she found none. Finally, she muttered something about escalation and neighborhood rules and took a hesitant step backward. Her phone remained in her hand, but the urgency to call the police had clearly diminished. The power dynamic had shifted, and she recognized, even if only subconsciously, that she was no longer in control. I didn't advance, didn't celebrate, didn't gloat. I simply maintained a calm presence, showing that my authority and rights were absolute and that any further attempt to challenge them would be both futile and legally untenable. Once she retreated, I returned to my work, unloading tools and moving vehicles efficiently, all while keeping a watchful eye on the driveway entrance. My guests, who had arrived earlier to help with yard work and maintenance, watched the scene unfold in a mix of awe and disbelief. I could see the subtle nods of respect, the understanding that sometimes property disputes aren't about confrontation but about presence, knowledge, and the ability to assert one's rights without aggression. The remainder of the morning passed uneventfully. I completed the tasks I had planned, parked the vehicles properly, and secured the driveway. The neighborhood, now fully aware that the situation had been resolved without incident, began its usual hum of daily life. Children played, neighbors tended to their lawns, and the sun climbed higher, casting a warm glow across the street. Reflecting on the confrontation, I realized how often people like Karen mistake self-assumed authority for actual power. They thrive on intimidation, on the perception that rules give them control over others, and on the fear that most people have of confrontation. But when met with clarity, calm confidence, and undeniable legal authority, their tactics collapse. Today, my driveway was blocked only temporarily, my property was respected, and my guests remained safe and undisturbed. As I sat on the porch later, drinking a cup of coffee and watching the quiet street, I felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond simply resolving a dispute. It was about asserting rights, maintaining composure, and demonstrating that true authority is grounded in knowledge, preparedness, and self-confidence. Karen had been challenged, and for the first time, her carefully constructed facade of control had faltered. The morning had begun with a simple task, moving vehicles on my driveway, but it ended as a lesson in respect, authority, and the quiet, unshakable power of standing firm on your own land. By the time the afternoon sun began to cast long shadows across the lawn, I knew the lesson had been learned not just by Karen, but by anyone who had witnessed the encounter. Property rights are not just legal concepts, they are a reflection of responsibility, authority, and clarity. And on that sunny Saturday morning, in my own driveway, I had made it unmistakably clear who was in control. The moment Karen stepped back after her initial confrontation, I knew that the situation wasn't fully resolved. People like her rarely give up after being challenged once, they simmer, they plan, and they escalate. I returned to my work on the driveway, trying to focus on moving vehicles and organizing tools, but I kept a careful eye on the street. My guests had settled into small groups nearby, chatting quietly, sipping coffee, and observing the lingering tension. The atmosphere was calm but charged, as if everyone was waiting for the next move in a game they didn't fully understand. It wasn't long before the sound of sirens cut through the suburban quiet. My first thought was that someone must have called the police, and my suspicion was immediately confirmed when a pair of squad cars rolled slowly down the street and stopped outside my property. Officers stepped out, radios crackling, and began approaching the driveway with caution. I straightened up, walked toward them with my hands visible, and greeted them calmly. "Good morning, officers. How can I help you?" Karen appeared almost instantly, rushing forward with her phone still in hand. She was visibly flustered, trying to assert authority even in front of law enforcement. "These people are blocking the driveway illegally. They're causing a hazard and disturbing the neighborhood. You need to take action," she insisted, her voice rising. Her confidence seemed to grow for a moment, as if the presence of police would validate her claims. I gestured toward my vehicles, neatly parked and partially moved as part of my work for the morning. "Officers, this is my property. This driveway is on my deed. I am temporarily moving my vehicles and tools as part of routine maintenance. There is no law being broken here, and my guests are fully authorized to be on my land." I could see the officers exchanging glances, their professional demeanor assessing the situation calmly but cautiously. Karen's face twisted into frustration as she tried again. "You can't just do whatever you want. This violates HOA rules, neighborhood safety regulations, and—" I cut her off politely but firmly. "Ma'am, the HOA has no jurisdiction on private property. My land, including this driveway, is mine. There are no violations occurring. If you have evidence otherwise, I am happy to review it, but as it stands, I am within my rights." The officers stepped closer to get a better view. I noticed their eyes scanning the property, looking at the parked vehicles, the work I had been doing, and the general layout of the driveway and surrounding land. They asked a few routine questions: whose property this was, whether there was any obstruction of traffic, and if anyone was in immediate danger. I answered calmly, explaining my ownership and the temporary nature of the work. Karen interjected repeatedly, attempting to present her version of events, but I maintained composure, speaking clearly and confidently. As I spoke, I noticed the subtle shift in Karen's demeanor. Her voice, which had been loud and commanding moments before, now carried an edge of uncertainty. The officers' questions were not directed at me in a confrontational manner, they were seeking facts. My answers, firm but factual, made it clear that Karen's claims were unsubstantiated. I could see the realization dawning on her. Her attempts to manipulate authority were failing. One of the officers, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense presence, finally addressed Karen. "Ma'am, can you provide documentation showing that this individual is violating any law? We don't enforce HOA rules on private property. If you have a legal complaint, it must be filed through proper channels." Karen hesitated, the clipboard shaking slightly in her hands. She muttered something about neighborhood rules, but it was obvious even to her that her argument carried no legal weight. I allowed a moment of silence to settle over the scene, letting the officers process the facts and Karen confront the reality of her failed intimidation. Then I spoke, calmly and clearly, letting my presence and authority carry the weight of the situation. "Officers, to reiterate, this is private property. I am authorized to be here, my guests are authorized to be here, and no laws are being violated. Any interference without legal cause would constitute harassment or trespassing. Karen's eyes widened slightly, and I could see her panic begin to rise. She had assumed that the police presence would instantly shift authority to her side, but now it was clear that her claims were weak and unsupported. The officers, professional and impartial, were taking my side based on facts, deeds, and observable reality. I could see the hesitation creep into her movements, the way she shifted her weight, the small stammer in her words as she tried to construct some semblance of control. I decided to take one more step in asserting clarity. Karen, this is a final warning. Step back and allow this property owner to perform routine tasks without interference. Any further attempts to escalate the situation without legal cause will be documented and could result in formal complaints. This is not a threat, it is a statement of fact. Her lips parted, but no words came. She looked from me to the officers, back to me, and finally down at the ground. It was a moment of frozen disbelief. For once, she had encountered someone whose authority, knowledge, and calm confidence outmatched her self-assumed control. The officers, having observed the facts, nodded slightly and began to step away, returning to their vehicles after ensuring there was no actual emergency. Karen, realizing she had no leverage left, finally retreated down the sidewalk, muttering under her breath. Her board members, who had followed her, also began to disperse, their expressions a mixture of embarrassment and uncertainty. The tension that had thickened the air all morning began to dissipate, leaving behind a quiet sense of victory and restored order. My guests, who had been watching, let out small sighs of relief and returned to their activities, laughter and conversation slowly filling the space once more. I spent the next hour ensuring my vehicles were properly parked, tools stored, and the driveway cleared. My guests helped, smiling and teasing lightly about the drama that had unfolded. It was a strange mix of mundane chores and extraordinary conflict, a lesson in how quickly ordinary days can escalate when someone misinterprets authority. I reflected on the situation and realized how important it is not only to know your rights but to assert them calmly, with evidence and confidence. By mid-afternoon, the neighborhood had resumed its typical rhythm. Children played, neighbors mowed lawns, and the sun shone warmly across the street. The events of the morning already felt like a distant memory, though the lesson remained vivid. Karen's escalation had been neutralized, not by aggression or anger, but by calm authority, legal clarity, and the unshakable presence of someone confident in their position. Sitting later on my porch, sipping coffee, and watching the street, I realized how often misunderstandings in property disputes stem from a lack of awareness or an overestimation of power. Karen had assumed she could dictate actions on private property and escalate matters to law enforcement without understanding the legal realities. My response, rooted in knowledge and preparation, demonstrated that true authority is established through competence, clarity, and presence rather than intimidation. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the driveway and yard, I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The police had left, Karen had retreated, and my property and guests remained secure. The situation had tested my ability to remain calm under provocation and to assert authority without conflict, and I had passed. The day, which began as a simple task of moving vehicles, had become a testament to the importance of preparation, confidence, and understanding one's rights. By evening, the street was peaceful once more. The vehicles were parked, the tools stored, and the driveway clear. I watched the neighborhood return to normal, the air filled with the sounds of daily life rather than confrontation. The lesson was clear: when faced with baseless challenges and attempts to assert control, calm confidence, legal clarity, and unwavering presence are more effective than anger or aggression. Karen had learned it, perhaps reluctantly, and I had reinforced my own understanding of authority and boundaries in the process. By the time the sun climbed higher the next day, the events of the previous morning had already become the talk of the neighborhood. I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching neighbors go about their routines, their eyes occasionally darting toward my property. There was curiosity, a little awe, and maybe even a touch of amusement at the confrontation with Karen and the police. It was clear that everyone had witnessed, in some form, the day's events and was trying to process how a simple driveway dispute had escalated so dramatically. I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, but I also knew that a final resolution was necessary to ensure there would be no lingering issues. I decided to take a proactive approach. I walked along the perimeter of my property, checking fences, gates, and access points, making sure everything was clearly marked and secure. I didn't want another confrontation to arise simply because of misunderstanding or oversight. While doing so, I thought about Karen and her tendency to escalate situations without thinking them through. People like her thrived on imagined authority, assuming that others would defer to them simply because they were loud or insistent. It was almost predictable, yet still frustrating, to witness. Around mid-morning, I noticed Karen approaching once more. This time, her demeanor was different. She was still scowling, but there was hesitation in her step, a subtle uncertainty that hadn't been present before. She was flanked by a couple of neighbors she seemed to be trying to rally as witnesses or supporters, yet even they looked unsure of how to act. I remained calm, hands visible, projecting the same quiet confidence I had maintained in the previous encounters. "Karen," I said evenly, "I see you're back. What brings you here today?" My tone was neutral, almost conversational, but carried the weight of authority. Her eyes flicked to me, and she opened her mouth to speak, then hesitated. I could sense the internal debate, the familiar desire to assert control battling with the dawning realization that her previous attempts had failed. She finally spoke, her voice slightly less confident than before. I just wanted to make sure everything was safe. You understand, right? The neighborhood." She trailed off, clearly searching for words that would justify her presence. I gave her a small nod, acknowledging her attempt to explain herself without accepting her implied authority. "Karen," I said calmly, "this property is mine. My driveway, my vehicles, and my guests are fully within my rights to be here. I have clarified this with law enforcement and ensured that all regulations are observed. There is no need for further interference. Your continued presence is unnecessary and unhelpful." Her lips pressed together, and I could see a flicker of frustration mixed with a reluctant acknowledgement. She was beginning to understand that her usual tactics, threats, calls to the police, attempts to intimidate, had no effect when confronted with knowledge, preparation, and authority. I continued to maintain a calm demeanor, allowing the silence to amplify the truth of my words. The driveway, the vehicles, and the property around us were indisputably mine, and I had every right to control access. At this point, I decided it was time to clarify the final piece of information that would firmly settle the matter. I straightened, meeting her gaze steadily, and spoke with deliberate calm. "Karen, it seems you are unfamiliar with my background. I am a high-ranking military officer. I have been trained in leadership, strategy, and conflict resolution. I understand chain of command, authority, and legal boundaries. My actions here are deliberate, lawful, and within my rights. This is not a threat, it is a statement of fact. Any further attempts to interfere will be taken seriously and addressed appropriately." The effect was immediate. Her scowl faltered, and her body language shifted. She looked momentarily stunned, a freeze overtaking her usual confident, aggressive posture. The board members who had accompanied her shifted nervously, sensing the sudden shift in power. My calm declaration, combined with the revelation of my military rank, had completely upended the dynamic. For once, she could not rely on intimidation or imagined authority. She was confronted with someone who not only understood the law and property rights but also had the experience, discipline, and authority to enforce them if necessary. Karen attempted to speak, to retort, but her words faltered. I didn't realize. She stammered, unable to form a coherent argument. The few neighbors who had come along looked between her and me, some clearly impressed, others quietly relieved that the situation was being resolved without escalation. I maintained my calm stance, letting the weight of my presence and the truth of my position speak louder than any words could. I gestured toward the driveway and the neatly parked vehicles. This is my property. My driveway, my work, and my guests are fully authorized here. I will not tolerate further interference. You may leave peacefully, or I will be forced to take further action to protect my rights and property. This is final. Her shoulders slumped slightly, and she muttered under her breath, clearly realizing that this confrontation was over. She turned and walked back down the sidewalk, followed by her hesitant supporters. I watched them go, feeling a sense of closure. The street returned to its normal rhythm, the hum of air conditioners, the distant laughter of children, the quiet shuffle of neighbors going about their day. My property, my driveway, and my peace had been fully restored. The rest of the day passed without incident. I returned to my work, organizing tools, moving vehicles back into place, and ensuring that the driveway was clear and functional. My guests helped where they could, and the tension of the morning gradually gave way to calm productivity. The sky was bright, the air warm, and the lakefront, the yard, and the driveway felt secure. It was a reminder that maintaining authority and protecting property requires more than confrontation. It requires preparation, knowledge, and calm confidence. As the sun began to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the driveway and yard, I took a moment to reflect. Karen's repeated attempts to assert control had been neutralized not by anger or aggression but by clear communication, legal knowledge, and the presence of authority that could not be ignored. My military background, which had seemed irrelevant at first glance, became a crucial factor in ensuring that the confrontation remained under control and that my property rights were respected. By evening, the neighborhood had resumed its usual rhythm. Cars drove slowly past, children played in yards, and neighbors tended to their gardens. The events of the morning were already fading into anecdote, the story of Karen's failed attempts becoming part of the collective neighborhood memory. I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, enjoying the quiet, the fading light, and the knowledge that I had handled the situation with professionalism, calm, and authority. The lessons of the day were clear. Standing firm in the face of baseless challenges requires more than simply asserting rights. It requires preparation, awareness, and the ability to project calm authority. Karen had been confronted with truth and authority in a way that she could not manipulate or ignore. My property, my driveway, and my guests were secure, and the lesson had been firmly established: interference without cause or authority will not be tolerated. As dusk settled over the neighborhood, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The confrontation, which had begun with a simple matter of temporarily blocking a driveway, had been fully resolved. My rights had been defended, my property protected, and my guests remained safe. I realized that true authority does not rely on volume, threats, or intimidation. It relies on knowledge, preparation, and the ability to act decisively while maintaining calm and control. By the time night fell, the street was quiet, and my driveway lay undisturbed. The vehicles were parked, the tools stored, and the property secure. I took one last look at the street, the sidewalk, and the neighborhood, appreciating the return to peace and normalcy. Karen's challenge had been neutralized, not through conflict, but through clarity, authority, and unwavering confidence. My property, my driveway, and my peace of mind were intact, and the neighborhood would remember that calm, knowledgeable authority always prevails over empty threats and imagined power.